So one of the topics we were thinking of, and we came to the conclusion of, which I think is a really good one, is multi-tenancy. And because a lot of people are either building kind of SaaS apps where it's applicable, and as we were mentioning before I started recording, there's compliance or regulatory concerns that some people have or don't have, and that can play a big part in how you're dealing with multi-tenancy, kind of at a database layer, kind of partition, at compute. There's so many different infrastructure concerns or not. So I think it's an awesome topic that I think a lot of people will get from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was just telling you right before we started, multi-tenancy is probably the single biggest source of business for my company in terms of both consulting and custom feature development. So it's definitely top of mind for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I get a lot of comments on some of the videos that I've done on it, and it is a big topic. So there's a lot of nuance there, especially when you're in the fire doing it yourselves. You realize how much there can be to it. I guess it can be simple and it can be complicated, I guess, depending on your requirements.
There's the complexity, and then there's the can we pull this off without it infecting our code base? How can we make our code still relatively easy to read and write while paying attention to whether or not we're handling multi-tenancy in every place? And then the change management aspect of that, of you don't necessarily have to do it through separate databases, but if you go down that path of separate databases, how are you going to keep all your tenant databases up to sync?
Yeah, absolutely. When I talk about whether it's shared or not shared, they all have trade-offs, obviously. The independent databases, obviously, that's always the question is, okay, well, how am I deploying? What does that affect to schema? Am I rolling out everything everywhere at once? Maybe I don't want to, so I just kind of partition a segment. But then those people, those tenants need kind of the new version of the app that works with that database while I'm rolling stuff out. So there's a lot of synchronicity that potentially has to happen, which is, yeah, like I said, it can go all over the place depending on how you want to do things, what your requirements are.
And then, add another level of complexity. What if you want to spin new clients up on the fly and do so without introducing downtime or take tenants down? That's been something I've had to work with clients on quite a bit in the past year. I've actually still working with a client right now where instead of going down the path of a database per tenant, that's a very, very hard thing to retrofit into a large existing system. So you have one massive database using what I call the conjoined model of tenancy, where you inevitably have a tenant ID column in every database or every database table somewhat. In this to ratchet up scaling, we started leveraging PostgreSQL table partitioning. So moving to a model of using a separate table, partition table for each tenant for each logical table. Now giving you the ability to get the scaling advantages of everybody, as long as you're always querying by the tenant ID, you're querying against smaller tables, but you didn't have to rewrite your code base. You didn't necessarily have to migrate so many different databases. And you even have the potential to be able to add or drop new per tenant partitions on the fly as new customers come in and out. But that's been a whole different layer of complexity than doing database per tenant. So no free lunch.
Yeah, and the thing that why I like doing this, because you're going to show some code, I'm assuming.
Oh, eventually.
But the beauty of that is a lot of the stuff when we're talking like this, or when my videos too, is I'm generally a little bit more abstract and don't get into the very specifics of how that looks like in code, depending on the tooling that you're using, because I can show it in one thing and people can kind of grok and get the gist of it. So it's like sometimes I often get the comments, okay, but how does this actually work in code depending on the tooling that I'm using? And A lot of it is, well, it's depending on the tooling that you're using and how you're going to do that. So I usually find it interesting, I guess, about how people think about it in code. Like I've given examples in .NET in different ways to do it, specifically about kind of identity, how it's coming in that way to know what tenant it is, either by the identity, usually, as well as kind of at that top level, turning that, say it's an HTTP request coming in, trying to turn that in a meaningful way where that tenant ID can just flow through every request, turning that really into what I call like an application request, is kind of morphing it from HTTP specific to something that is just going to flow through the rest of your system, like any type of message, right? And then it just so happens that that tenant ID is a part of it. So like you kind of initially said, is that it's kind of seamless. You're not thinking about it a whole lot. There's some stuff you have to do. Oftentimes in code, for me, it can be, a big proponent of kind of delegates as factories of things where you're passing what that tenant is, if you need to, but just making it not cumbersome on the developer to like have to know you need to do this. I despise you just need to try harder. Like I feel like how you develop your own internal system, APIs, whatever you're using, should just kind of like inherently lead you down a path of success, rather than it's like, oh, well, you need to know to do this. And if you forget, well, now you're screwed. It's not really a great place to be. And I find with multi-tenancy, you can kind of get in that place depending on how you're building it out right from the get-go, in code, because like you said, behind the stuff, things can change a little bit on, like you said, like whether it's be per database, per schema, different tables, partitions. You can kind of give yourself the luxury of even modifying and kind of evolving that if your application kind of like how you're dealing with that tenant kind of guides you down a way in the first place where you have a bunch of different options.
There's that. So at the infrastructure level, so this is the part where I start throwing things in. So you as you know, I'm the technical leader of the Marten project, that is document store and event sourcing tooling on top of Postgres for .NET developers, and also the Wolverine tool, that's mediator / asynchronous messaging framework / alternative HTTP framework for .NET. So put the whole thing together, and we have the critter stack, right? Think of transformers all combining up to be a bigger transformer. So at the storage level, with Marten, we have multi-tenancy completely baked in. And regardless of whether you're using per database per tenant, or if you're using what I call the conjoin model, the tenant ID in every column, Marten mostly hides that from you. You just say, I want a Marten session for this tenant. And it'll figure out what to do, either how to connect to the right database, or it's going to connect to the same database, but it's going to quietly put the filters automatically for you to, I'm only going to show or load data from this tenant, no matter what you do. So that, as a developer, you talked about kind of the repetitive code and how brittle that can be. So as a developer, for the most part, you're never even thinking about tenancy filters in any one case, because if you have to think of it, if you have to do it right every time, you simply won't. You'll miss something. So Marten injects that completely inside internally. You can do the same thing with EF Core. You have to kind of retrofit things on top of it to kind of think of it as builder tricks of, when I resolve a DB context, something else is going to recognize this is a tenant ID, and it's going to put the filters in for me. But so soup to nuts, problem you're talking about of, let's say that our system starts from HTTP requests, because it's just the easiest thing to understand. On the Wolverine side, we have infrastructure to detect the tenant ID based on every possible way you could do it. If you want to do cookies, query strings, part of the route, something totally custom, pick it off of the messages coming in, just whatever. Pick up the tenant ID, but inside of your HTTP endpoint handler or DI, whatever it is, when we construct the Marten I document session to give to you, we've already detected what the tenant ID is, and we're just giving you, here is a session that already connects to the right tenant for this request, and you just code normally.
Yeah, like that. I guess that's what I'm getting at is there's that benefit of, I gotta use my words carefully here. I don't want to say magic, but there's a lot abstracted from you that's doing all of that, determining what the tenant is, so you can just not have to repetitively kind of feel like you're doing boilerplate stuff constantly, that it's this tenant, it's this tenant, it's this tenant.
Exactly.
Like, you know which way it's coming in. Get that out of the way so I don't have to deal with passing this tenant around every which way everywhere.
Exactly. And then taking it, you alluded to this too, taking it to the asynchronous messaging side of things. Enterprise system, it may be just a web service, but it's probably a web service, which probably also communicating via asynchronous messaging. Azure Service Bus, RabbitMQ, AWS, SQS, something's Kafka. Something's in there where you're exchanging asynchronous messages. So, another set of challenges we would tackle with Wolverine on the messaging side is being able to relay, I grab an HTTP request that's spawning a message, publishing an event, whatever it is. Wolverine's also able to track the tenant ID as part of the message metadata. It's not in your message body. You don't have to think about it, but if you're dealing with a request that's spawning a message, Wolverine's going to bring the tenant ID with it. And if you're publishing to asynchronously to yourself through Wolverine or just to another Wolverine app, on the same side, in the message handler on downstream from you, it's going to pick out, here's the tenant ID from the message body, and it's going to do the same set of trickery. It is going to say, from Marten, okay, with this tenant ID, you give me a session that points the correct way. To get even crazier about it, I know you've talked about transactional outbox patterns on the series. Just to get crazy with things, because this is realistic, if you have a per tenant database, then you also need to have outbox tables in every per tenant database for the outbox pattern to work. So, downstream, Wolverine, we're tracking the tenant ID, we're giving you a connection to the right Marten database, and then we're also tying into the correct outbox tables. So this stuff just works and flows.
Yeah, the one thing that I guess, like we were saying, there's so many different kind of permutations of what you might want to do. So when that's kind of seamless to you, how do you think, I guess, how did you design this so that you can kind of get out of that mold potentially? I'll give you the example. Is like a system I work in is multi-tenant, but there's a lot of tenant-to-tenant communication. I would say a lot. There's some tenant-to-tenant communication where maybe I have one tenant actually publishing an event or queuing some message for another tenant. So in that particular case, I want to consume, say, that event. I know who the sender is, but my tenant, I'm someone different. So I'm not connecting to their database. I'm just receiving their message and I need to act upon it. But I still want to know who I want to know who the sender is. So I see the sender as the tenant, but it's not me.
Gotcha. So, these kind of the exception cases, kind of pain.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how would you break out of the mold? Can you break out of the mold?
Yeah. So purely on this, we'll get to the messaging side second. Purely on the Marten side of things, as long as you're dealing with tenants that are in the same database, you have ways to override kind of on an operation by operation basis. Hey, I have one single unit of work. I want to save this document to tenant A, this document to tenant B. You have a way to override this one, instead of being for the tenant that the session was open for, doing kind of multi-tenant spanning operations. It's been a lot of that's caused us a lot of edge cases, a lot of bugs over time, but it's it's in a good state now. On the messaging side of things, that whole magic, I'm going to propagate the tenant ID. This message handled. I'm going to propagate any outgoing. That's a default. So on a message by message basis, as you are publishing the message from handler A is publishing message B, it can override and say, no, this message I want to go to tenant B or tenant C, whatever it's going to be. So just like you said, there's got to be an escape. There's always got to be an escape hatch where you can do cross, or even harder, you can do multi-tenant kind of operations.
Yeah, but the beauty of that, right, is you can do it, but you're only having to do it when you need to do it, and then the defaults are what's saving you from all the vast 80-20 case here, where the vast majority of the time you're not needing to do that. It's pretty standard, which is like what my experience is. The edge cases are exactly that. They're exceptions, not the rule.
Yeah, but absolutely right. But if you have a user base that's big enough, and the critter stack team tends to attract clever people sometimes, they'll have the edge cases. You get enough developers together and enough enterprise environments, they'll hit all the edge cases too. So yeah, we've had to allow for all that kind of thing.
So what do you think, I guess, when you started building this out, like from the Marten side, from the Wolverine side, were you pulling this a lot from user base, personal work experience? Because like we were saying before we recorded this, we were kind of talking about it can go all over the place, right? So I'm curious of like how you kind of initially thought about this when you started kind of thinking about multi-tenancy. Like where was it initially going from or started, and then how do you view it now of like, I guess, what you've learned along the way?
Yeah, and continuing to learn along the way. People still throw new things at us all the time. Originally, years ago, it was, let's get a whole bunch of features in place so we can sell this and get community and whatever and be rock star developers. So, the easiest possible way to do it was, originally it was that conjoined model. A lot of people were asking for multi-tenancy. The fastest way to get going was throw it all in one database and figure out how to make the default filtering just work. That was great. And then a lot of people started clamoring for the multi-database model. And, we gave them workarounds for a long time, because the biggest problem we faced in that case, it was actually dealing with change management across databases. And then, resource utilization. The singleton document store for Marten is expensive to create. You really don't want one of those for every possible tenant in your system if you can help it. So it just took us a while. It took us some big structural changes a couple of years ago to be able to address multiple databases. That was a big win. But the next thing, we started out with a model where you have to tell us statically what are your tenants and what are your databases. From there, people started asking, well, what if I want to add tenants at runtime? What if I would like to be able to just spin up new databases, even take them down? So that led to a client engagement this time last year for a JasperFX client, my company, by the way, where we created a model where the tenant information can live in a database. So you have a centralized database, kind of an index table of here's my tenant, here's a connection string to its database, and go that one step farther. This time, we need to be able to discover new databases on the fly. If I ask for a new tenant, like we get a new customer, we want to just go spin up their database, the shell of the database, not even the real thing. I'm just going to put the connection string in that master table, and your application, your code should just find it and activate it and go. So, Marten even had to track, do I know about this database? If not, go probe and try to find it. And now that I know about this database, is the schema set exactly the way it's supposed to be? And if not, go do it in memory the first time I encounter it and lock it in. That was a huge step. Stuff that's just come in lately. I told you about the table partitioning. In the last month for customer working kind of in an IoT field. Um, Centralized model, SaaS hosted, but their clients are going to be, all over the place, and they're communicating through either RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus. So we talked all this time about databases, but for them, we now have a model in Wolverine where you can use a completely separate Azure Service Bus namespace isolated for every tenant, plus global, and do the same thing with RabbitMQ. So if a message coming in from this Azure Service Bus namespace, it's this tenant ID. If I'm sending a message to this tenant, I actually use this RabbitMQ connection. And that's something that was not on my radar 2 months ago, but it came in from either user needs or repeated user requests, or better yet, hey, how much would it cost to build this?
Yeah, I think that's a great example for people, listening and thinking why I keep saying there's so many different ways you can kind of do this, is that you can be partitioning, like we were saying, by table, you can be partitioning by database, you can be, and it's just not the database. It's like I said, it's things like messaging and your queues, or how you're doing any of that infrastructure. It's the actual compute where the app is actually running, whether you want to have, kind of like I was saying before, different kind of segments. It could be for a variety of reasons, geographical, as well as how you roll out. Maybe you want to kind of stage stuff where maybe we have these customers that are more prone to getting stuff a little bit sooner. And we see the stability there before we roll everything else out. There's so many ways that you can slice and dice this. But I think obviously that adds complexity. So it's got to be worth it. Like there's trade-off there. But I always come back to how you do this in code, and not having to feel like you just inherently have to know everything you need to do with the tooling that you're using. And that developers we're reliant upon code reviews or people inherently knowing, oh no, you can't do that. You have to do it this way because of multi-tenancy. Yes. I find that frustrating because it's just not like I was saying, it's not the path to success. To me, it just wants to be as much of an afterthought as possible in the day-to-day of just writing features, building out whatever that you need to build out. It doesn't need to be, to me, at the forefront all the time, because I think it is so important, security, etc. Don't get me wrong, but that's exactly the reason why I don't want to have to think about it all the time from like a code level perspective. I don't want to think about, I got to figure out which where the endpoint for this is, or what queue I'm putting this in, or which instance of Azure service, wherever I'm, I don't want to have to deal with this all the time. I just want it to be seamless, where I'm, like you're saying, kind of at runtime, knowing it's just going to figure out, knowing what's happening. It's abstracted from me. Everything you brought up, I feel like either I've implemented or I've had to think about at some point. So I can relate a lot to it started statically, then maybe it happened at runtime, where we got to figure out where we're going to. So I think anybody that's kind of done it can probably relate to what you were talking about there. And anybody that's getting into it, you're about to run into all of these thoughts probably.
Yes. But I'm also going to pitch, if you're doing this for the first time, try to pull something off the shelf.
That's 100% agreed. Yeah, tooling, like the tooling that you're using, that's hardened this, to me, is like, I couldn't describe how much. It's the same, to me, like this multi-tenancy is the same thing to me as talking about Wolverine or any type of messaging. I always say, there's a lot, I got to be careful how I say this. There's a lot of value in understanding and going through the pain of implementing some messaging patterns and concepts. There just is, because you'll really understand when you use a tool that does it for you, what the heck it's actually doing. However, I don't suggest doing it yourself. So it's kind of this catch-22 where like you're using, say, for example, you're using Wolverine, you're seeing like there's patterns that it's going to apply for you that make it seem easier to do these things, and there's a reason why they exist in that space. But oftentimes you just won't really see the because you haven't kind of been burned by it or implemented it yourself. You realize why it's there.
Yes, I have talked to people that strongly feel you should try to build it yourself first, but those tools like Wolverine or Mass Transit and Service Bus, they solve problems that you don't know exist yet.
100%, 100%, yeah. And until you run into it, and that's kind of the problem, is that you will run into it.
You will, or some of it's kind of subtle. Of you're having performance degradation at runtime, and you may not even realize it because of XYZ, or you're dropping data. You're dropping data, and you're not detecting it. We mentioned that outbox, transactional outbox, just coming in from behind from clients that bring us into existing systems. One of the biggest problems I see over and over again is not understanding message durability, where they've rigged up their own kind of in-process domain event publishing somewhere or another, just inevitably with Mediator. But they've done so in a way that's not robust, where they could easily be losing work and losing data at runtime, and there may not be any way to catch that it's happening until a client or a customer starts complaining.
Yeah, like the example I use in this kind of scenario is, because I've done it myself, unfortunately, is like a claim check. It's you have something that you want to be putting in a message, and you realize, hey, we're putting in all this data in these messages, and they're enormous. And what's the problem here? Like, there's consequences of that, and then you're realizing, okay, this is not a good idea. These messages should be small. We'll just add some identifier to the message and then throw what the actual contents are elsewhere in some blob storage. And then you're implementing this pattern, and then you realize, oh yeah, that's a thing that commonly exists because you run into this. And then there's easier ways of doing it that's kind of more just seamless to you. So yeah, I think I feel like no matter what we say, people are going to kind of go down the path of implementing some things themselves. But I am a strong advocate for using something like Wolverine for this, like for its intended use case, because you're going to run into all the kind of messaging patterns that everybody, I think, falls into eventually.
Oh, absolutely. Plus, I mean, it's just better to use tooling that is documented and has a community around it, so that you don't have to solve every problem yourself.
So we went on a tangent here about messaging a little bit, but that it does, because it's a part of multi-tenancy, depending on how you're, I guess, dividing, conquering, and partitioning messages, events, and kind of that. I guess we could talk about this, is how do you, like, one of the things that always comes up for me is in that space is partitioning it for kind of SLA performance reasons of kind of wanting, okay, sure, you have different queues for different priorities, but if I have one tenant being a noisy neighbor, if you will, of if we're sharing a queue, that could be problematic. So how like, what have you seen and what's possible there in terms of it, kind of in that space of how you want to partition messaging?
Pretty well exactly what you've already mentioned. So at the database level, it should say you've got to, we've talked about the conjoining model, and we've talked about database per tenant. There's also a hybrid approach where, 5 tenants could be on one database, and the huge, noisy, problematic, yells at our CEO all the time tenant could be in its own database. I've seen people do exactly what you just expressed, or the reason they want multi-tenancy is for exactly that reason, to get some process isolation. Not necessarily with Wolverine, but it's possible there. But also exactly that of, the customer that's the gold customer. Maybe you put an isolated listener for only their work and you dedicate extra handlers or Kubernetes pods for that. I mean, this is pretty advanced work. This isn't. I don't think this is something the average line of business developer is going to hit very often, but it absolutely does come up. I mean, this is something you could easily face.
Yeah, ultimately, what we're describing a little bit is, or what you're describing a little bit, is the ability to mix and match. That's how I would describe it.
Yes.
It's like you're deciding, okay, for this segment, we're doing it this way. For this segment, maybe we do it a different way. And yeah, it probably is pretty, again, one of like an advanced usage. But the reason why it works is because you're not limited. You can just, you kind of mix and match. That's kind of the beauty of it.
Yes. Now, I mean, I would say when I was coming up, what I was taught as a super young architect was the way to maximize scalability is try not to have specialized nodes, try to be able to let the work spread evenly across all the running nodes. But that goes out the window when you have either one client that has a tighter SLA, or I've seen cases where a client might have much larger, slower jobs where you're worried about that tenant hogging all the resources for everyone else, or maybe you limit them to a certain queue, and so you can isolate their work and let everybody else work proceed a little more clean.
Yeah, no, it resonates with me. That's why it's kind of what I was alluding to. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
because when you're dealing with that SaaS environment, like there's even as you're exposing certain functionality, you may not realize like it's always this way, right? It's like happy path is things are running normally, whether it be an HP request and how quickly that executes, or it's processing a message and like the happy path is, oh, it's quick, everything's good, throughput's fine. And then all of a sudden there's something that happens to that, like how it's being used, that just throws a wrench in the whole thing. And then that's when you're in the fire realizing, oh, maybe we do need to kind of segregate these things or isolate these things differently.
Yeah, and so taking the tangent off that, we've talked about the roll your own versus pull something off the shelf. I think in the last couple of years, I think most of the bigger infrastructure tools are getting open telemetry and open telemetry metrics more or less baked into the product. I mean, Wolverine and Marten, I think that every meaningful piece of performance data is going to be emitted now through open telemetry or open telemetry metrics. Getting a tool off the shelf that bakes that in a way that you don't have to think about it, where there's no repetitive work to add instrumentation. It's just it's done around database transactions for you. It's done around HTTP requests, done around message handling. But if you have that information in a sync, open telemetry tools, Grafana, whatever it's going to be, that can help you identify when you have your performance problems. Hopefully these tools are tagging it by tenant ID, so you could even segregate, you know what, our problem is because of this one problematic customer.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing. Like Otel's the same way. Just get out of my way, just work. Like I don't want to think about it.
Well, I have seen this. It's been a couple of years. I've seen systems where the architect came up with some kind of mandatory custom instrumentation screen system where, enforcing through code reviews and pull requests of you must have this tracing explicitly done in every handler, where it slows people down, it adds a lot of code noise, you're distracted by this other stuff, and you're constantly getting your hands smacked if you haven't done it exactly right. You don't want that. You want cleaner code. You want it to just work.
Exactly. That's exactly what I've been alluding to, is just get out of my way and let me focus on what the heck I'm doing and what I'm trying to implement that actually has value to my end users. And like, that's the stuff I really want to be spending my attention on. Not that I'm following these 10 rules of how I need to use this metric, or I got to be doing this, or etc. I'd rather be focusing on the task at hand rather than all this not frivolous, but like this other stuff that's just a constant repetitive. So yeah, I think tooling in that sense, and not rolling your own, because like I said, I'm a pretty big advocate, and I've done a few videos on not rolling your own, but I get the value because I've done it of rolling your own, and you learn a lot there. So I guess my comment would be roll your own, not in production, I guess is a good way to put it.
Do it as a side project.
Yeah.
Do it as a side project, a learning project off the
Yeah.
side. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, like people can listen to this, watch videos, and I think some of it will kind of make sense, more or less sense, depending on kind of where the stage at is of what they've implemented. Um, but yeah, a lot of it just comes down to experience. Like if you've never really implemented any type of multi-tenant system, you might not really know where to start. And that's my hope of anything in conversations like this. It's you kind of hear some terms, maybe it doesn't like what we're saying right now doesn't fully make sense, and then it kind of gives you a starting point of okay, maybe I got to go look at this. They said this, so then you kind of start seeing the bigger picture. To the biggest picture to me is of realizing what I was alluding to. What you were saying is kind of there's so many options. It comes with complexity, but and it's just that mixing and matching is there is no right way, and things evolve. Like we are saying, like you have a new customer, and all of a sudden, how it's behaving or what their expectations are isn't kind of working the way it is now. You have a lot of options that kind of evolve, given the tooling that you're using supports that. Which is full circle to where I was kind of starting at this. Is like if you're using tooling or your app's built in a specific way, you can do that mix and match. You're not kind of locked in to a specific way how you're dealing with multi-tenancy at the database or different infrastructure. You're kind of, I don't want to say limitless, but you got a lot of options. I always call it just doing things that give yourself options.
So in the extreme programming days, some folks called it reversibility. Kind of
Yep,
understanding
exactly.
what decisions are easily changed and what decisions are not, and you have to be locked in. And the more reversible you are, the more adaptable you can be. Just how much more wiggle room you have to learn and grow and change over time versus, nope, I got to get the database schema correctly the first time or we're done. But to the point you've made several times, I think is good. Is look, the critter stack approach. We got to the point where there's no multi-tenancy showing up anywhere in your command handlers or your query handlers. You would be able to change tenancy models, or migrating the database is going to suck no matter what, but you would be able to change the way you store the data without impacting your code hardly at all.
Yeah,
Unless you're getting into cross-tenant operations, and then
yeah, but that goes into the kind of the comment I was making of like just giving yourself options, or like what you're saying, reversibility. It's like it's not, oh my gosh, like how are we possibly going to do this now if we need to move this tenant? Sure, yes, like that. If there's that type of data migration, then like that's a issue no matter what. That's not magic. That's gonna fix that, right? But just the general idea of being able to transparently, okay, stuff's getting routed this way now instead, or data lives here now after we've done that migration, and I'm not ripping code apart to do so. That's kind of those options. I say like I think there's a lot of patterns, concepts, and things that you can do that I say are, and I think what I'm realizing in this conversation, but I kind of probably knew, just never really expressed it, is it's patterns, concepts, and tooling that I like say that are what give you options. And I like to think of things as they're just low cost. So my simplest example of this, and I'm still struggling, maybe you'll have an example of this or a different way of explaining it than I am right now, is a really simple example of this is with CQRS. I've done videos on it enough, but I'm still struggling to capture how the simplicity of it gives you options. And I think it's until you've used it, you can have an epiphany all of a sudden of like, this is really, really simple, and it's low cost in terms of like how you're implementing it. It's just it's just separate reads and writes, and kind of that channel. But how that can have such an effect on what you're building, how you're building it, I don't like I'm still lacking to give an example of this in like on my video, like in code or something that can really give like a how profound it can be.
So I don't know that I had the exact answer for you. I would also tie it in. I would tie it back to the vertical slice stuff
Yes.
of because it goes together pretty well. Of here, it's going to allow you to do functional things in the system in a tighter area of the code, much tighter area of the code. Just it's going to allow you to concentrate, focus on what you're actually doing.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the beauty of like again patterns,
Um,
concepts. But then, like I was saying, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about tooling. I've been thinking about okay, well, like you're saying, if you don't have to think about a tenant in even something like some type of message handler or entry point, and it's kind of just there. And how you're configuring that is not in the every possible place you can imagine. It's just out of your way, and it allows you to kind of give you that option to evolve or change. And I can't stress enough about how I'm trying to think of things. Now I'm thinking about tooling included now that'll let you evolve and change. Because at least the
well,
systems that I build, they're long lived. Like they're not
yes,
right.
yes.
Like I've been in one for 10 years now. They're long lived. Stuff's changing. It's evolving, and I want to be able to evolve.
So one thing. So I saw it from someone else's. I think Chris Sainty. I think had I watched one of his talks in DC on vertical slice, but he made a point I really liked is we spend so much time. You know, here's the inevitable bagging on the clean architecture part. Um, we spent so much time and energy in building layers upon layers and all this stuff to isolate infrastructure so that we could conceivably magically swap out infrastructure. But what we really change is business functionality, um, business functionality and requirements. So what we should have been doing the whole time is optimize our ability to change business requirements, and then I would say maximize your ability to be able to reason about the functionality in your system, and all that clean architecture and ports and adapters and abstractions and layers and spreading things out all over the place. It makes it potentially a lot harder for you to reason about what I have this command coming in, what ends up happening. Get into a lot of applications where they're having performance problems. And what it kind of comes down to is one operation coming in is making way too many database calls, and they don't even know it because it's so far down the call stacks and it's all so scattered around behind interfaces and IOC stuff that you can't easily tell what your system is doing unless you happen to have an open telemetry tracer telling you here's what your database commands are coming out. The CQRS model, if you go down farther the path of like I think it's easier with Wolverine, of course, but even if you're using Mediator, don't bounce through a service layer and a repository layer and whatnot. If you have code that is only related to that one use case, your one command handler, put it directly in your Wolverine handler or your Mediator handler. You can use separate methods. You can keep technical concerns out of your business logic, but put all that closely related code as tight together as you can, so you get one place to look at, reason about the code, and hopefully understand what are the side effects, what are the database calls I'm making, so that you have some remote chance of being able to batch up database calls instead of going crazy chatty because you can't see what it's doing.
Yeah, I think the problem, and I've tried to express this a lot, of what you just said and the pushback people give against it is, okay, well, if I'm, say, in a handler and I'm using some, whatever it is, Marten, EF, core, whatever the case may be, people are like, oh my gosh, like I'm coupled to that directly there, and then they are losing their minds over it. And my comment generally to it is that inherently isn't the problem. The problem is when you're using that massive DB context in 1,000 different places. And those 1,000 different places are related to almost nothing. Like they're not related to each other at all. So it
Yes.
goes back to kind of this,
Yes.
to circle back a little bit to multi-tenancy in a way, it's about how you're segregating things. It's if you have a use case, like you're saying, let's say it's a command line or something, like that's a specific action. It maybe relates to maybe like 10 other things that may share the underlying data model that's there. It's 10 things. Like it's 10. It's not 1,000, it's 10. So if something does need to change, whether it's to that underlying schema, that's not hard to manage, right? So I always post people, it's the degree of coupling that you're putting in those things to other things. Versus I think like that gets a little bit lost when you just have one repository under one DB context or whatever the case may be that's used in a mirage of different places. Like, well, that's why I have it. It's like, yeah, but that's still a problem. That's still a problem that you have 1,000 usages, right?
Yes.
All over the place. So I think what you can lower down what the degree of coupling is, then you can start seeing, okay, it's not horrific here that I'm coupled directly to whatever my underlying storage is.
So I think I get the exact same arguments. And a lot of the arguments is, well, if we don't do the clean architecture, and I mean the full project template, lots of different projects, all that kind of thing. If we don't do clean architecture, then it's follow mud. Because those are the only two options that ever happen. So I think I've got three arguments for people. Kind of not really three things that are alternatives here. One, what's the biggest thing that's going to give you reversibility or ability to change your system is good test automation. Effective, fast-running, reliable automated test suites. That is the one single thing that is going to do the most for you to be able to change and evolve your system, period, end of story. Beyond that, I would say, as far as being able to swap out, even if you really wanted to swap out infrastructure, what you need to do is make sure modules within your system are decoupled from each other. You just can't, it's not possible to swap out the whole database for an entire gigantic data layer at one time. You'll never get time. The business partners will never let you do it. It's not feasible. But if you could conceivably do it module by module, maybe you could do it incrementally. And then lastly, just talking about, really this is getting into the handler by handler level, at least for the Wolverine side, trying to push really hard on Jim Shore's idea of the A-frame architecture. To decouple business logic from infrastructure, you don't necessarily throw a bunch of hub and ports and adapter abstractions every which way. Instead, think of kind of a logical controller up top of, I'm going to go reach into the infrastructure. I'm going to get the data you need. I'm going to push it to the business logic. And the business logic may be telling me, I want these changes made. I want these outgoing messages sent. But the business logic is passive. It's hopefully a pure function, giving these inputs. This is the outcomes that I want. And then the A-frame controller up top is calling into databases to save it, is calling to message infrastructure, outboxes, whatever. That's even fully baked into Wolverine handlers. But that's our way of, you can still have your loose coupling from business logic and infrastructure, but you can do so in a way that gives you a much lower code ceremony overall and enables you to vertical slice architecture with a whole lot less code. Keep your testability, keep your maintainability, get rid of all that code ceremony and the million projects and scattering code every which way.
Yeah, I guess the one to circle back to kind of the multi-tenancy view of this is, I guess what you're getting at in terms of that is, would you say that Wolverine then is opinionated?
Oh, very much so.
That's by design.
It is by design. It is by full-fledged philosophy. I mean, going back to the failed FUBU thing, when our whole tagline was framework that gets out of your way. Our mantra is low code ceremony. So no repetitive code, try to keep extraneous infrastructure noise out as much as possible, and we wrap around your code as much as possible.
Yeah, so like in the terms of multi-tenancy, like you're saying, it's kind of out of the way. Um, but it's just not that. It's just in general, kind of get the hell out of the way and do the
Yes.
common repetitive things that you're going to be building with
Yeah.
people all the time, and just let it do its thing.
Same. Yeah. Same thing. I mean, this is another tangent, but Wolverine's version of the decider pattern from event sourcing, where we're going to push. Here's the current state of your event stream. Here's the right model. Here's your command. Wolverine's going to go gather it up for you. It's going to look at the right, it's going to do the multi-tenancy, it's going to look in the right tenant database, it's going to give you the data, and it's going to push the data to you. So all you do is you just worry about business logic and workflow logic and hopefully a pure function. You don't even have to write asynchronous code most of the time, hopefully.
So what I'll do is I'll include some links chosen by you. I'll put some into the description for code samples so people can get a gist of the multi-tenancy and just stuff in general about, yeah, the kind of low code and what something typically looks like, so they can get a sense of it.
Sure.
And then, yeah, because I think it'll give people a better sense of probably, yeah, like in terms of multi-tenancy, but just in general of how tooling can help you evolve, I guess. Because like I said, I'm always thinking about it from a patterns, concepts, but it absolutely is tooling as well. Kind of getting you down a particular path, like I was saying, a successful path, rather than it being, well, you need to know this and you need to know this and we're doing it this way. It's
Well, my pet peeve from about 10, 15 years ago. Well, the first thing you need to understand is the lambda calculus.
what I was about to say is I can't remember who was doing it recently. As a joke, was creating like a Roslyn analyzer of all the most horrific things that people are usually doing. I can't remember who was doing this. Maybe it was Aaron Stannard. He was creating.
Yes,
He was
yes.
creating Roslyn of everything like most people despise that are in code bases. But that's what it makes me think of. It's like everybody's doing like these repetitive things. Can we not just focus on what's really important rather than? So I do like the philosophy, and I think we're kind of on the same page there, Jeremy. Is like it's stuff in the right spot. It doesn't need. I don't need it. Like I say, useless indirection all over the place. There's value. I think it's just what happens is there's two sides of the extreme that people land on often, and it's either this over abstraction, indirection, and what I suspect people, when they push back about what we're talking about or anything that you have or my videos, is that they think we're talking the exact opposite extreme of that, and we're not. But yes. I think they assume it is.
Yes.
They assume it's just a free for all.
That's what I get from a lot of folks, that if it's we're either doing clean architecture and solid, or it's going to be chaos, ball of mud chaos. And there's no third alternative.
Well, hopefully people can check out some links because we'll see that it's not that way. Yeah, and I think even looking at the multi-tenancy portion of it and it getting out of your way will give people, I think, a better idea too of what tooling can do for you to just let you focus on what you're actually trying to build.